Welcome to the Rational Nationalist. Why is it so hard to get people to do the right thing? Wouldn't it be great if everybody just did what we wanted without being asked all the time? Since that will never ever happen, what are we to do? A traditional liberal society would say to leave the decision to the individual, but post-liberal philosophies increasingly favor government interventions in pursuit of the common good. Now, I'm all in favor of pursuing the common good. I'm just skeptical of the government's ability to do so. I'm not a libertarian per se. I'm not necessarily philosophically committed to the idea of letting consenting adults do whatever they want, especially when it comes to some of the more extreme libertarian positions envisioning a Wild West type of society that you see being proposed in some corners of the internet. I'm more of a team player or nationalist and a live and let live kind of guy, but as a realist, I do understand that in reality, whoever holds the shotgun gets to sing whatever song they like. Power tells us what the government can do. It doesn't tell us what the government should do. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do it. In fact, that's kind of the point of the Constitution. The Constitution attempts to set out the limits of what government can legally do to prevent the temptation of those in power from abusing it according to their own whims. Additionally, motivated by the liberal philosophy of the time regarding the inherent rights of man, the Constitution included certain rights upon which the government cannot infringe, period. This idea of inherent rights has fallen under attack by many who wish to use the government for the common good, whether the common good to them means eliminating hate speech and censoring racists, or restoring the family and promoting Judeo-Christian values. Now, I can't make you care about other people's rights, about legalities, or about constitutional processes. If you're an authoritarian, you're going to be an authoritarian. Good for you, I guess. Rather, what I'm going to talk about is the limits of what the government actually can accomplish and why the harder government grasps, the more things society seems to let slip out of its control. Let's start with a breakdown of what the government and the law is and how they go about pursuing the common good. At the end of the day, the government is just a collection of individuals. Laws are edicts they pass that they expect people to follow. Yes, we could stack philosophical turtles upon turtles about how government and law feature things such as legitimacy, the monopoly of force, sovereignty, and a lot of other nice-sounding terms that we do discuss on this show fairly often, but all of it's just a smokescreen to cover up that it is turtles all the way down. The government at the end of the day is nothing more than the strongest group within a specified territory capable of ruling by exercising a monopoly of force, one of those hoity-toity terms I just dumped on, or at least enough of an asymmetrical force advantage to have de facto control of the specified area. The government pursues its own interests as a general rule. Sure, we like to say that it pursues the common good, and in democracies, this is pretty much the case, so long as you're willing to accept that we'll define the common good by the will of the voters, and not by whatever you personally think the common good is, everybody else's opinions be damned. And for this episode, we will assume, or grant, that the government is actually attempting to pursue the common good in good faith. After all, this episode isn't about corruption or perverse incentives, but it's about the limits of well-intentioned people to improve society through governmental mechanisms. What are these mechanisms? In the book, I go into length about how law and morality constrain human behavior within social contexts and how the government is limited to law. If you try to legislate morality, then by definition, it becomes law. And at the end of the day, you cannot force people to internalize anything. In other words, you cannot force people to change the way they think. Even totalitarian societies like China don't have complete control over their people's minds, as evidenced by their persecution of Muslims, Buddhists, and Christians, and the ongoing beliefs of the target groups despite this persecution. What they do have is total control of their people's behavior. Anyone who doesn't agree with the CCP keeps their mouths shut or ends up like the aforementioned religious groups or Jimmy Lai. The degree to which people have internalized the message is unclear, as is the degree to which the Chinese people follow the CCP's edicts when no one is looking, or whether they continue to pursue this common good, which in this case is fully defined by the CCP. Essentially what I'm saying is that the common good needs to be operationally defined some way, and unsurprisingly, given what we said about power in the beginning, it's the government who gets to define what exactly this elusive common good is. And maybe this is enough for some. Certainly there seem to be many in Silicon Valley, D.C., and both political parties who have great admiration for people who bend whole societies to their will by use of force alone, like Joseph Stalin and Chairman Mao. However, both of their successes were relatively short-lived. After their deaths, both the Soviet Union and Communist China made at least some effort to move on and distance themselves from the policies of their former leaders. Today, the Soviet Union is gone, while the United States is still going strong. Or it's still going, at least. We just celebrated our 250th anniversary. Communist China is not even 100 yet. In fact, the Soviet Union formed, rose, and collapsed within a century, which is shorter than the 250 years of relative success the United States has experienced, or the 1,000-year reign, more or less, of the British monarchy from 1066 on. Yeah, I know you've had War of the Roses, English Republic. It hasn't always been a smooth ride, but the point is both societies have experienced continuity and potentially as a result, experienced sustained success. Is there a pattern here? I certainly argue yes, that political systems, especially those that effectively divide power among a politically active populace, such as the U.S. Constitution, set societies up for greater sustained success and prosperity than others, particularly those that rely on the talents of a single individual or group of individuals. Regardless of how the government is chosen, it is still limited to the use of force or hard power to achieve its goals. Basically, as with pretty much all other human interactions, the government has two options to modify behavior and get people to do what they want: the carrot and the stick. Both come at a cost. First, the carrot. This is pretty simple. You pretty much pay people to do what you want them to do, either in the form of a subsidy, a benefit. Tax incentives have been huge. For example, child tax credit to encourage procreation, at least potentially, as well as marriage, and so on. For example, the Affordable Care Act's goal was to ensure that all Americans have health coverage, so one of the things they did was offer people money in the form of subsidies to buy coverage, though the ACA did include a stick in the form of tax penalties for the non-compliant. This can also serve as attempts to serve or alleviate social ills. For example, welfare programs alleviating poverty have been attempted to reduce crime rates by eliminating the need to steal. Either way, I don't think I'll run into much pushback when I say that the carrot comes at a cost. Everyone can see the cost of the carrot, whether it's subsidies, benefits, tax breaks, carve-outs, or whatever. On to the stick now. The other, and probably the more common and familiar, way that the government achieves its objectives is to ban the undesirable behavior. This is also often viewed as being relatively cost-free. After all, since the government isn't doing something, it's just telling people what they can't do, that shouldn't cost any money, right? So all the government has to do is pass the law, say mission accomplished, and pat themselves on the back for having achieved the common good. Unfortunately, passing the law is the easiest part of the process. Let's demonstrate with a relatively simple hypothetical. We pass a law to stop people from killing each other, since that's pretty much basic governance 101. Now, depending on the civic capital or the moral inclinations of your population, they may or may not follow the new law of their own accord. After all, many people do follow laws out of civic duty, their own principles, or a devotion to the common good, even when they know they could break the law with impunity. Of course, if that's the case, you probably didn't really need the law in the first place, right? I mean, if you have a city of people who are willing to just follow whatever laws you pass without question, you're probably not in the chaotic situation where everyone's running around doing whatever they want and killing each other. The very fact that you need a law means that it's directed at those who intend, or at least are incentivized, not to comply with the law. What we do about them is the key question, and this is where law and morality diverge. With morality, we don't have to do anything really. That's what distinguishes law from morality. If something is immoral but not illegal, then people are generally free to engage in this socially proscribed behavior should they so choose. And we all know people who do this. I assume you know at least one person or can think of one person who you would call immoral but isn't necessarily a criminal. There are no consequences for acting immorally. Well, scratch that. There are no hard consequences or legal consequences for acting immorally. There can still be consequences. Think about that immoral person we mentioned earlier. How likely would you be to, say, want to start a business venture with them versus an equally profitable venture with a baseline human or even better, a moral one? These consequences can vary from consisting of nothing more than social stigma or sideways glances, but as cancel culture demonstrates, they can be quite severe. The point, and this distinction between law as a form of social control, is that there's no formalized enforcement mechanism coming from the government, though private organizations may institute ethic boards, disciplinary committees, and so on. With law, there is. Going back to our hypothetical, morality is basically what existed before we passed our anti-killing law. Even though nobody had ever explicitly said it, I'm assuming the rest of society didn't look too kindly on those who killed others, depending on the circumstances and the victim. However, nobody was committed to doing anything about it. The murderer either got away with it or was the victim of extra-legal adjudications such as mobs or revenge killing. Either the way, nature just ran its course. However, now that we've passed a law to prevent killing, as soon as somebody kills someone, we have a job to do, because if we don't, then none of our laws will ever be taken seriously again, which would kind of undermine the purpose of having these laws to begin with. So we now have to pay people and provide the resources to figure out who was responsible, arrest them, and hang them, or if we're against the death penalty, then we have to pay somebody to keep them locked up for the rest of their lives, which brings me to my next point. We also are going to need people and resources to administer whatever punishments we see fit for violating our laws. Since most penalties or most crimes aren't capital punishment worthy unless you're Draco, there's another burden for the state to bear, which is why fines are so popular, but of course that opens up a lot of surface area for corruption and perverse incentives. Anyway, this is only in the clear-cut cases where guilt can be readily established. Otherwise, we also need to establish some sort of fact-finding mission, such as a trial, to figure out whether the accused is actually guilty. Is all this hassle worth it? Probably yeah, for killing people and other serious offenses. But this is a question worth thinking about before passing any law. Is it such an issue that we're willing to pay somebody full-time to make sure that nobody engages in the prescribed activity, then arrest anyone who does, pay someone else to decide the punishment, and then someone else to enforce it? And just to pick on one law, I'll take the anti-sodomy law at issue in Lawrence v. Texas as an example, since even one of the judges who voted to uphold the law acknowledged that it was uncommonly silly. Now, I get that down in Texas you might not like buggery. This is Texas after all, and like Texas back in at least the early aughts, probably earlier. But does it really bother you so much that you're willing to pay somebody to devote their lives to going around and making sure that nobody is buggering each other? Wouldn't you rather the police and the courts spend their times preventing murders, robberies, and other things in which the benefit to the common good is more direct and obvious? And maybe they can do both, sure, but seriously, there's only 24 hours in a day, and we all know how much things start to slip through the cracks when people are stretched thin. Stress leads to mistakes, abuses, and so on. Pointless laws add unnecessarily to this workload and gives corrupt cops more excuses while making it harder for honest cops to do their jobs. And of course, things don't always work out the way we'd like. As I've mentioned, human society is complex, and anyone familiar with chaos theory understands how unpredictable changes to the system can be. Like a butterfly flapping its wings and causing a hurricane, government interventions often cause unintended consequences. Prohibition led to the rise of organized crime, and there's evidence that more stringent residency restrictions for child sex offenders leads to higher recidivism rates as people simply go off the list entirely. In other words, with government interventions, our best intentions often backfire. For this reason, I tend to think that government ought to work more on a leaner, efficiency-based model. Focus on doing the things that really matter for the common good, that the government can do effectively. Ignore the areas where society can self-government, which is most areas, even if it might not produce our ideal outcome, and keep things as simple and transparent as possible. Finally, at the end of the day, law is swimming against the current, trying to coerce people to behave in a way that doesn't come to them naturally. If it did, they would already be doing it. This is evidenced by the fact that we feel the need to pass the law in the first place. We don't like how people are acting, and we can't get them to stop any other way. Otherwise, we would just accept things the way they are. The question, however, isn't whether or not we like the status quo. The question is how certain we are that our interventions are going to make things better and by enough of a margin to justify the cost. Given how complicated society is, this is a pretty high bar to pass. Without dedicated empirical follow-up, which is difficult both due to the complexity and the cost of such research, and the fact that there are often perverse incentives, that is, politicians who push the policies, trying to put their thumb on the scale, or financing their own research to muddy the waters if it's looking like it's going to turn out poorly, it can be very difficult to pinpoint the exact impact of any single policy. However, we do know the cost of the alternative. Nothing. Simply let nature take its course, allow society to govern itself, and simply accept the outcome. Even if that means allowing people to do things we don't like, unless we are sure that our government interventions will ameliorate the situation, it might be better to just leave well enough alone. Otherwise, you risk paying a potentially steep cost to accomplish nothing or potentially even make things worse in some unpredictable manner. Thank you for joining us on the Rational Nationalist. If you'd like to hear more, please either subscribe on YouTube, check us out at lejallis.substack.com, or you can also find us on TikTok or X. Thank you and have a great day.